June 1994, New York City. Emily Carter, 24 years old, is a rising legal assistant at a Manhattan law firm. She leaves work one evening, planning to meet her boyfriend. Hours later, her car turns up abandoned near a park on the edge of the city. The keys are gone. Her purse is gone. But there is nothing else, no struggle, no blood, no witness to explain what happened. When her parents finally report her missing, their reaction stuns detectives. No public appeals, no emotional pleas, no posters on the street. Their silence seems colder than the case itself. Police take notice. Rumors spread quickly. Did Emily's family know more than they admitted? The investigation turns to her boyfriend, Mark Jensen. He has a history of temper and control. Friends say Emily wanted to leave him, yet when detectives press, he produces an alibi. Without DNA, without surveillance cameras, and without new witnesses, the case collapses. Emily Carter is gone, and no one can say why. For years, her disappearance lingers like an unfinished story. Was she murdered? Did she vanish by choice? Or was there a darker arrangement hiding in plain sight? If you want to follow this journey, to see how a missing woman, a silent family, a violent man, and a fateful twist all collide, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this story. Your support helps bring these forgotten cases back into the light. Emily Carter was born in 1970 in New Jersey. She was the only child of Robert and Linda Carter, a couple who owned a small neighborhood grocery store. They weren't wealthy, but they lived comfortably. Her parents were respected in their community for their honesty and hard work. They poured their efforts into raising Emily, giving her opportunities they never had themselves. From an early age, Emily stood out. She was bright, dependable, and steady in her studies. The case also serves as a warning. Harold Miller was not a stranger in a dark alley. He was not a faceless figure who drifted into town. He was part of the campus community. He passed students every day. He lived a normal life after the crime. Married, raised children, attended church, worked jobs, paid taxes. Neighbors described him as quiet, even kind. They waved to him on the street. They trusted him. None of them knew that under his floorboards lay the remains of a 20-year-old woman whose future he had stolen. The contrast between the man he appeared to be and the crime he committed is one of the most unsettling parts of this story. It forces the question: how many others like him have lived undetected, their crimes buried by time and silence? For the Thompson family, the revelation closed one chapter but opened another. The trial they had once hoped for would never come. Harold Miller died before the truth emerged. There would be no cross-examination, no jury, no sentencing. The justice system could not put him behind bars. And yet, in another way, justice was achieved. His confession ensured that his name was recorded in the files, attached permanently to the crime he committed. His family, blindsided by his admission, chose not to hide the truth. His son went to police instead of protecting his father's reputation. And because of that decision, Claire's story finally had an ending. Susan Thompson expressed both relief and sorrow. She said, "It's too late for punishment, but not too late for the truth." In 2010, Claire was finally buried with dignity. White flowers covered her casket. Friends who were still alive from her college years stood with her sister. The university sent representatives. Members of the community came. On her headstone were carved the words, Claire Thompson, 1945 to 1965. Still, Emily's life wasn't just about work and routines. There was one relationship that consumed much of her personal time and, eventually, played a defining role in her fate. Her relationship with Mark Jensen. Mark Jensen was 3 years older than Emily, born in 1967. On the surface, he looked like a promising partner. Tall, broad-shouldered, and well-dressed, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who wanted to be noticed. In the early 1990s, Mark worked in finance, a sector that thrived in New York, but was also notorious for its sharp edges and shady connections. To those who didn't know him well, Mark seemed like a catch, handsome, ambitious, and socially connected. He drove a nice car, took Emily to expensive restaurants, and made a point of showing her off in public. But the people closest to Emily saw another side. Friends noticed that she was often nervous after being with him. She avoided certain conversations, and her smile seemed forced when Mark's name came up. Some recalled moments when she confided in them that Mark could be controlling. He would call unexpectedly to check on her, demand to know where she was, and occasionally show up at her workplace unannounced. At first, Emily brushed it off as overprotectiveness. But over time it became clear that his behavior wasn't simply about affection. It was about control. Arguments between them were not uncommon. Emily's friends later told investigators that she often seemed trapped in the relationship. She had said more than once that she wanted to leave him, but there was always hesitation. The fear wasn't vague, it was tied to Mark's connections. Rumors circulated that he had ties to low-level criminal groups in the city, the kind of people who used intimidation to get what they wanted. Whether those rumors were true or exaggerated, they were enough to keep Emily from seeking help. She never went to the police. She never documented the abuse. Instead, she endured it quietly, hoping perhaps that Mark would lose interest or that she could find a safe way out. Her workplace, though reputable, was not free of shadows either. The early 1990s saw multiple law firms entangled in financial scandals, some linked to organized crime. Employees like Emily had little control over what went on at higher levels, but they were not blind to whispers and rumors. For someone already living under the stress of a volatile boyfriend, these undercurrents only added another layer of insecurity. By June of 1994, Emily was 24 years old. Outwardly, her life looked stable: a respectable job, a tidy apartment, and a boyfriend who appeared successful. But inside, she was living under pressure, trying to maintain a fragile balance. Colleagues remembered that in the days leading up to her disappearance, she seemed more tense than usual. She was quieter, more distracted, as if something weighed heavily on her mind. One colleague specifically recalled seeing Emily on June 16th, the day before she vanished. She was at her desk flipping through her planner. There, in her neat handwriting, was a note. Dinner, Mark, 7:30 p.m. It was written casually, like any other appointment, but in hindsight it became one of the most chilling details of the case. That single entry was the last verified plan of her life as Emily Carter. Her colleagues noticed she left work with her usual bag, her files neatly tucked away. She wasn't the type to storm out or forget things behind. There was no sign of distress in her departure, no outward clue that she was walking into danger. But the truth was that Emily was heading straight into the very relationship she had feared for months. Looking back, everything about her background suggested predictability. She was structured, careful, and intentional about her life choices. That predictability is what made her sudden disappearance feel so wrong. People like Emily do not simply disappear in a city like New York without someone noticing. And yet, The background of Emily Carter is not just a portrait of her as a person, it's the foundation of the mystery. To understand why her disappearance captured attention, one must first understand the contrast. A disciplined, promising young woman on one side, and the storm of control, intimidation, and hidden dangers on the other. And then, in June of 1994, everything changed. A dinner scheduled with her boyfriend, a car left abandoned near a park, and a life that suddenly stopped without explanation. In the next part, we'll follow the final hours before Emily vanished, and how that single night turned her story into one of New York's most haunting cold cases. If you want to keep uncovering Emily's story with me, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think her disappearance was planned from the beginning, or was she forced into silence? Stay tuned, because the timeline of her final day may hold the first clues. June 17, 1994 began as an ordinary Friday for Emily Carter. She woke early, dressed in her usual neat office style, and headed into Manhattan for another long day at the law firm. To her colleagues, it was business as usual. Emily typed documents, filed motions, answered calls. She stayed focused, as she always did. But a few noticed something different. She seemed tense, quieter than normal. She smiled when spoken to, but her eyes drifted, distracted. One secretary remembered later, "She wasn't herself that day. Something weighed on her." On Emily's desk calendar was a single line in her careful handwriting. Dinner, Mark, 7:30 p.m. Her coworkers didn't think much of it at the time. But in hindsight, that note marked the final entry in Emily's documented life. By late afternoon, the office began to empty. Staff were heading to weekend plans, happy hour drinks, or the train home. Emily stayed behind, finishing paperwork. Around 6:30 p.m., she finally packed up her leather case and purse, telling a colleague she had dinner plans and couldn't stay longer. That was the last time anyone from her office saw her alive. A security guard at the lobby recalled seeing her walk out around 7 p.m. She moved quickly, not lingering, not chatting. The guard remembered her carrying her work bag and purse, looking like she was in a rush. She walked across the street to the parking area, got into her car, and drove off toward Queens. That sighting placed her firmly on her way to meet Mark Jensen. What happened over the next 2 hours remains one of the most puzzling mysteries in New York's crime history. At 9:30 p.m., Emily's car was discovered abandoned in a public lot near a park on the edge of Queens. The doors were unlocked. The vehicle showed no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no blood, no clear struggle inside. The keys were missing. Her purse and work case were not there. To an outsider, it looked as if she had parked and walked away. But those who knew Emily immediately found that unlikely. She was careful, disciplined. She did not leave her car in unfamiliar areas, especially at night. That abandoned car was the first and only solid piece of evidence in her disappearance. At 11 p.m., her parents, Robert and Linda Carter, called police to report their daughter missing. She had not returned home. She had not answered her phone. On paper, the family acted promptly, but their tone was strange. Officers later described them as unusually calm. They reported Emily missing, but they did not insist on urgent searches. They did not call neighbors. They did not reach out to the press. That quiet, almost cold response stood out. Police noted it immediately in their first reports. Family lacks expected level of distress. In the early hours of June 18th, police officers did a cursory sweep of the park and the surrounding streets. They walked the lot, shined flashlights along the path, and knocked on a few doors nearby. Nothing. No witnesses came forward that night. No one reported seeing Emily. The absence of urgency became clear. There were no roadblocks, no extended searches with dogs, no alerts broadcast on television. In 1994, with no digital surveillance and no DNA testing available for quick results, officers often dismissed cases of missing adults as voluntary. To them, Emily could have walked away on her own. But Emily's friends at the law firm disagreed. Meanwhile, Mark Jensen quickly became the focus of police attention. Investigators asked where he was on the night of June 17th. He provided an alibi, claiming he had been with business associates at a bar in Queens. Witnesses backed him up. Records showed transactions made on his credit card. For the time being, police could not place him with Emily after she left her office. Still, suspicions lingered. Mark had a reputation for aggression. Friends said he drank heavily, gambled, and sometimes lost his temper in public. But suspicion is not evidence, and in 1994, without cameras or digital trails, police had little to build on. The days stretched into a week. No sign of Emily appeared, no credit card use, no calls from her phone. No belongings surfaced beyond the abandoned car. That silence spoke louder than anything else. Her office grew uneasy. Colleagues who once dismissed her private life began to wonder if they had missed the warning signs. One admitted years later, "She was scared. We saw it, but none of us pushed her to explain. We thought it wasn't our place." For police, the case hardened into suspicion but not resolution. The boyfriend looked guilty, but his alibi held. The family looked suspicious, but there was no proof. And Emily's car sat in the impound lot, offering no answers. The community, too, began to speculate. Neighbors questioned why the Carters weren't putting up posters, why they weren't speaking to television crews. In most missing person cases, families cry publicly for help. In this case, silence replaced tears. By the end of June 1994, the case had stalled. Detectives filed notes, recorded interviews, and moved on to the next urgent crime in the city. Emily Carter, 24 years old, simply vanished. But the lingering questions never went away. Who saw her after she left work? Stay with me as we move into Part 4, the investigation and suspects. And if you want more true crime stories like this, where every clue matters and every silence hides a secret, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts below. Do you think Emily's family was covering for her? Or do you think all eyes should have stayed on Mark Jensen? The report lands on a Friday night desk and looks routine. A 24-year-old woman fails to return home. Officers drive to the public lot by the park, shine flashlights across rows of cars, and stop at a compact sedan with the driver's door unlocked. It's Emily Carter's car. Inside, nothing jumps out. No broken glass, no torn fabric, no blood on the seat rails. The glove box holds registration and insurance. The ignition shows no damage. A careful officer dusts the handles and steering wheel. Only Emily's prints and a vague smear that is too partial to hold up. It is 1994. There is no city-wide web of cameras to read plates coming and going. There is no rapid DNA panel waiting in a van. The file opens as "Adult Missing." That label slows everything from the start. Detectives retrace the last known steps. At the Manhattan office, colleagues recall Emily leaving with a neat stack of files and her leather bag. She said, "Dinner with Mark, 7:30, and waved. A security guard remembers her at the revolving doors, glancing at her watch, walking quickly toward the street. No one sees who she meets after that. The night swallows the gap between an office lobby and a quiet parking lot in Queens. They tow the car to the precinct garage and go over it again in better light. Floor mats lifted, trunk emptied, spare tire compartment checked. Nothing points to a struggle. The absence of her work bag raises a question. Did she take it with her? If it was stolen, the alibi checks out enough to hold water. The bar has a tab in his name between 8 and 9:30. A bartender remembers him. A coworker confirms a round of drinks, some loud sports talk, then leaving. The times line up loosely. Not tight enough to be airtight, not loose enough to break. It's the kind of alibi detectives hate, just credible enough to move on. Friends and colleagues describe a different Mark. They talk about overbearing phone calls, unexpected appearances at Emily's office, a habit of keeping tabs on her commute. One friend remembers Emily with shaking hands after a fight. She said, "I want to get away," the friend reports, but she wouldn't go to the police. Detectives note pattern of control, underline his name in red, and still run into the same wall. Without a scene, without a body, without a witness, suspicion stalls. They turn to the family. Robert and Linda Carter open the door and let the detectives in. The living room is tidy. Family photos show Emily at graduations, birthdays, a smile that looks practiced as she grew older. The conversation is strange. The parents report her missing, give routine details, and remain calm. Too calm for the detective's taste. "We don't want a circus," Robert says when asked about a press appeal. She's an adult. Maybe she needed space. The mother nods, hands folded in her lap. There is no push for a public vigil, no posters stapled to telephone poles, no tearful plea at a podium. Detectives leave with a sense that something is off and nothing to prove it. The car becomes the hub of the early effort. Officers canvass the lot and nearby streets. No one saw the car arrive. No one saw anyone leave it. A jogger mentions a man hanging around near the park bathrooms earlier that evening, not from around here, with a dark jacket and a cap pulled low. Another neighbor adds that a stranger had been drifting along the fence line in recent weeks. Maybe a vagrant, maybe a dealer. The descriptions don't match each other well enough to build a clean composite, but the idea of an unknown man near the scene takes root. A sketch artist produces a generic face. It circulates in the precinct, then in a short news blurb. Tips trickle in and go nowhere. The lead drains time and attention. While uniformed officers chase the stranger through shelters and soup kitchens, the core questions wait on a clipboard. What did Emily do after she left work? Did she meet Mark? If not, who else? Did she drive the car to Queens? Did someone else? Detectives request phone records and find little that's helpful. Emily used a landline at home and a desk phone at work. Cellular phones were not yet a constant in every pocket, and call logs tell a thin story. A call from Mark earlier that afternoon. A call from her mother about groceries. Nothing after 7. Bank records show ordinary purchases. Her credit cards see no action after the disappearance. They go back at Mark. They ask him to walk them through the week. He does. They ask if he'll take a polygraph. He declines on a lawyer's advice. He repeats that he had nothing to do with it. The anger that friends mentioned peeks out in small flashes. His jaw tightens at certain questions. He calls one detective a hack. It is enough to send every antenna up, but still not enough to move a prosecutor. They also go back at the Carters. The parents keep the same steady face. They won't agree to it. They examine the possibility that someone else, an acquaintance, a stranger from the commute, caught her between boroughs. Transit police have nothing. Taxi companies can't confirm a relevant fare. The park has no evidence of a struggle. A maintenance worker says he found cigarette butts near the far hedge and a beer can behind the bleachers, but that's any Friday in summer. The lab lists them, and then the chain of custody bumps into the limits of the era. No profiles, no database to compare unknowns against, no clear tie to Emily. The false hope of the stranger grows legs. A second jogger swears she saw a man in a cap leaning into a sedan the week before. Was it Emily's? She can't be sure. A clerk at a nearby deli says a man with a scar bought a coffee around 8 that night and looked wrong. He can't say what kind of wrong. The sketch is revised, then revised again. Patrols make a show of presence in the park. The lead generates airtime without generating momentum. It is a distraction that feels like progress, and it pulls resources away from quieter lines of inquiry. The phone logs that might show patterns if viewed over months rather than days. The family's travel habits. The possible shelter waiting somewhere outside the city. The case diary fills with appointments. Detectives speak to a college friend who shares a blunt detail. She said, "I'm done with him. I have to disappear to get free." That line reads like a metaphor at first. Without other proof, it sits in the margins. A supervisor asks the team to be careful about overinterpreting fear. "People say they'll disappear all the time," he says. "Most don't." The remark, practical on its face, becomes a kind of permission to prioritize other angles. They check Emily's workplace for anything that looks like a professional threat. The firm declines to open its internal files. A partner says Emily was a valued employee and a delightful young woman. The human resources file shows no complaints, no disciplinary actions, nothing that points to a motive. A junior associate mentions office gossip about Mark showing up uninvited. He adds, "We all thought she should leave him." Again there is concern. Again, there is no crime to pin down. Weeks pass. The rhythm of the investigation slows. New York in 1994 is busy with violence and theft and drug cases that come with evidence the city can touch. A missing adult case with a clean car and a clean lot goes stale quickly. Detectives try to hold a spot for Emily amid the noise. They run down every tip that mentions a body of water or a duffel bag near an overpass. Each one fails. The chief asks for an update and receives the same answer. Suspected foul play. Primary person of interest has an alibi. Family's posture is unusual. No physical evidence to support an arrest. When the first month ends, detectives draft a case summary for the file. It reads like a map with roads that stop at fences. Emily leaves work. Her boyfriend claims he never sees her. Her car moves without an obvious driver. A family reports her missing and then rejects any public search. A stranger hovers at the edge of a park and evaporates when pursued. Years later, the second guessing will come easy. If they had pressed harder on the family's travel, they might have noticed regular weekend trips up the interstate. If they had put a tail on Mark a week longer, they might have caught the edge of his obsession in ways that changed the calculus. If they had not thrown so many hours at a composite that described half the men in the borough, they might have seen the outline of a different story forming. A young woman planning an escape, parents who knew more than they could ever say, a city that offered both cover and danger. But in the summer of 1994, the present tense rules. Detectives request a limited ground search of the park with dogs. The results are negative. They host one small community meeting. Attendance is thin. A local paper prints a brief piece with Emily's photograph and the headline, "Woman Missing, Car Found." The family refuses interviews. Mark gives one short statement outside his building. "I hope she's safe." He looks annoyed, not devastated. Viewers project what they want onto his face. Some see a killer. Some see a man tired of being accused. By autumn, the case file grows heavier without getting deeper. The lead detective writes a memo recommending a cold case designation unless new evidence surfaces. The captain signs it with a note about re-evaluation at 6-month intervals. On paper, that is not the end. In practice, it means the case will sit in a metal drawer, opened when a similar case shakes loose a fragment, or when a new detective flips through old names for something to learn from. The final push before the file closes is small and telling. An officer calls the Carters to ask again if they are willing to do a televised appeal. The father declines again. "We believe the police will do their job," he says. The mother adds, "We don't want to make things worse." The officer hangs up and writes, "Family declined appeal, tone even." When the cold case stamp finally hits the file spine, it's not a dramatic moment. No one announces it to the press. It is a date on a form and a change in where the folder lives. But that small administrative act does something to the story. It fixes the public image of Emily as gone without answers. It freezes Mark as the man people point at without proof. It hardens the town's view of the Carters as cold, and the Carters let it harden. And it leaves a detective like Frank Doyle with a taste he can't spit out. A sense that the truth was in arm's reach once and then slipped. The last lines of the summary speak plain. No witnesses beyond initial office guard and neighborhood hearsay. Vehicle processed, no probative evidence. Primary person of interest, established alibi. Family posture atypical, no obstruction noted. Parallel lead regarding unknown male in park, unproductive. Recommend cold case status, reopen upon receipt of credible new information. And then the phone stopped ringing for Emily Carter. The sketch of the stranger curls at the bottom edge of a bulletin board and is replaced by a new face tied to a different night. The park recovers its routine, busy on weekends, empty after dark. The lot fills and empties. The city breathes and forgets. The truth remains where it is, out of sight, waiting for someone to look at the same facts with a different question. If the investigation had stayed centered on the people closest to Emily instead of drifting toward a phantom, would the detectives have noticed patterns that mattered? Regular parental trips out of state. A young woman with a careful calendar who stopped paying for storage on one unit and started sending postcards from nowhere. A boyfriend whose control didn't disappear just because his alibi looked clean. Those threads were there. They were thin, and they asked for patience the squad didn't have. Years later, when a journalist opens the drawer and pulls the file into the light, he will see those threads and follow them. In 1994, the case goes quiet. The detectives go back to calls with blood and witnesses and cameras. The family goes back to work behind a closed door. Mark goes back to his bar stool and his stories about being targeted. The stranger disappears into rumor, and Emily Carter becomes another unanswered name on a list that grows one line longer every week. A story paused mid-sentence, ready to resume only when someone dares to ask why the calmest people in the room stayed so calm for so long. The disappearance of Emily Carter slipped from the front pages almost as quickly as it appeared. In the summer of 1994, the case had sparked whispers across New York, but within months, when no new leads emerged, it was quietly pushed aside. Detectives had run their course. They interviewed Emily's colleagues, questioned her boyfriend, Mark Jensen, noted the strange calm of her parents. Still, there was no DNA, no security cameras, no reliable witnesses. After half a year of frustration, the case was stamped cold. The files were boxed up and stored, only to be pulled down if something new appeared. Nothing ever did. For the Carter family, the silence was almost louder than any headlines. Their unusual behavior, reporting Emily missing but showing little urgency, made them a target of gossip. Some neighbors whispered that Robert and Linda knew more than they admitted. Others were convinced Mark Jensen had gotten away with something. Either way, the Carters were branded the Cold family. In a small New Jersey town, that label stuck. As years went by, the case lived on not through action but through rumor. Half of the community believed Mark was guilty, protected only by a convenient alibi. The other half pointed fingers at Emily's parents, suggesting they had helped her vanish, or worse. In the absence of answers, speculation filled the void. Journalists occasionally dusted off the story, usually around anniversaries. Local papers ran short features, "Where is Emily Carter?" or 6 years since the vanishing of a young lawyer. Each time reporters knocked on the Carters' door. Each time Robert and Linda refused to comment. No pleas for help, no interviews, no public appeals. Just silence. And the silence was damning. To the public it looked like indifference. To detectives it looked suspicious. But suspicion is not evidence. The case remained stalled. Frank Doyle, the lead detective. By the late 1990s, Emily Carter was no longer seen as an open case, but as a story, an urban ghost story told in whispers. College students in the city traded theories in dorm rooms. Cafe patrons retold the tale. The young lawyer who vanished, the parents who didn't care, the violent boyfriend who walked away free. Everyone had an opinion. No one had proof. Her name appeared in side columns when other women went missing. Sometimes she was mentioned on late-night talk radio, lumped together with other cold cases that symbolized failure in law enforcement. But there were no vigils, no foundations, no family campaigning for answers. Emily became a headline that resurfaced once in a while, then faded just as quickly. What the public didn't see was that the police had quietly checked the file a few times over the years. In 2001, after new DNA techniques became more common, there was brief talk of re-examining evidence. But Emily's car had been cleaned and released back to her family long ago. Her belongings were never found. Without physical evidence, there was nothing to test. That chance was gone forever. The Carters grew older, remaining in their New Jersey home. To outsiders, their silence seemed heartless. Why wouldn't parents fight for their daughter's memory? Why did they act as though nothing had happened? Some neighbors stopped talking to them altogether. Their small grocery business became less and less visited. Customers didn't want to shop at the store run by the Cold family. Mark Jensen, meanwhile, was a ghost in his own way. After the mid-90s investigation failed to pin him down, he drifted. His job in finance was gone, his reputation ruined. But still, he lived freely. And the fact that he was never charged only deepened the wound. People said, if he did it, how is he still walking the streets? That question kept Emily's disappearance alive in late-night conversations. Even for nearly 2 decades, the disappearance of Emily Carter was nothing but a cold shadow in a forgotten file. But what happens when silence shatters and secrets surface in the most unexpected way? Stay with us as we move into Part 6, where a journalist's persistence uncovers the shocking breakthrough that changes everything. If you're finding this story gripping, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us keep telling stories of cases that deserve to be remembered. The file sat in a cardboard box for 16 years. A thin stack of reports, a few photocopied photos, a one-page summary that called it an adult missing case. John Miller pulled it from the archive in early 2010 because the silence bothered him. A young woman leaves her Manhattan office. Her car is found by a park, and then nothing. No press pushes from the family, no anniversary vigils, no fresh leads. Just a quiet that did not match the noise of New York. He wrote a single line in his notebook. Why did everyone stop talking? He started where the police stopped. He read the original intake. He read the interview summaries. He circled 2 things. The first was Mark Jensen, the controlling boyfriend who somehow had a neat alibi. The second was the odd calm of the Carters, a calm that had turned public opinion against them. The cold case label had done the rest. The box was shelved, the story had cooled. John decided to warm it up. He did not call the Carters first. He drove. He went to the parking lot where the car was found in 1994. The asphalt had been repaved, the lights upgraded, the trees taller. But the angles were the same. From the far corner you could see the road. From the road you could turn toward the river or toward the bridge. If you were leaving the city in a hurry, you had options. He mapped the final day again. A clerk slid a folder across a counter one afternoon. It held a rental registration for a small duplex filed in the early 2000s. The tenant's name was Claire Donovan. The form was clean but incomplete. No birth certificate attached. No prior address listed beyond out of state. John compared the handwriting on the signature line to a copy of Emily's signature from her old HR file. The capital C and the long tail on the final N were almost identical to Emily's capital E and long tail on the R. He scanned the curves again to make sure it wasn't wishful thinking. The shapes matched. He needed more. He found a thin ID photo of Claire in the town's records. Muggy lighting, the kind of snapshot used for library cards or a permit. He copied it and placed it beside a 1994 headshot of Emily from the New York law firm's yearbook. The jawline was softer, the hair darker, but the eyes and the mouth, those were not tricks of light. They were the same. He did not publish. He kept digging. He asked around the duplex, not with a camera, not with a microphone, but with questions that felt like neighborly curiosity. People described a quiet woman who avoided social gatherings and took early morning walks. She bought the same groceries each week. She kept her mailbox empty and her curtains half drawn. She told one neighbor she once worked in New York, a long time ago, and did not like to talk about it. Another remembered a moment when a visitor at the door called her Emily. The woman laughed too quickly and corrected him. "Claire," she said, and shut the door. John checked utility accounts. The electric meter had been opened under Claire's name in a year that did not match the lease. He found a handwritten request to backdate a service start. A harmless, clerical thing on paper, but unusual in pattern. Someone was building a life in stages, as if timing mattered. John trailed other threads. He sat in the diner and watched faces. He learned the rhythm of the mail truck and the shift change at the mill. He saw Claire finally on a Tuesday morning leaving the grocery with a paper bag. Her face was older, but it held the same careful expression as in the law firm photo, posed, polite, guarded. He did not approach her then. He took a breath and wrote a third line in the notebook. She did not disappear. She hid. He drove back to New Jersey and parked outside the Carters' small store. He waited until closing. He approached them not as a hunter but with the facts he had. Their first reaction was denial. Their second was fatigue. He spoke quietly. He mentioned the inn, the florist, the timing, the town. Linda's eyes filled, not with anger but with the gravity of years spent carrying a secret. Robert asked him to leave. John did, but he left behind his card and the truth that he had enough to write. He worried about the ethics. He thought about danger. He tested his reporting with lawyers who had once mentored him. He removed anything that hinted at the precise address. He chose to tell the story of a woman who staged a disappearance to survive and a family that pretended to be cold to keep her warm. He believed exposure might push the police to review the old file and offer protection if needed. He believed sunlight would deter harm. He was wrong about that last part, but he could not know it then. Before he published, he returned to Vermont to verify one more piece. He watched the duplex from a distance, long enough to see a gray sedan with New Jersey plates arrive in late summer, just as the inn's registry predicted. Two older adults stepped out and paused by the mailboxes. The woman looked around in the cautious way of someone who has learned to count exits. They did not stay long. They left a small package on the doorstep and drove off. John let them go. He did not knock. He did not tip his hand. He wrote the story over a week. When the piece went live, the response was immediate. Some readers felt relief. They said the obvious, of course she ran if she was in danger. Others were furious. They asked how a family could let a community ride waves of fear and suspicion for 16 years. The comments turned. Sympathy and anger rode the same thread. The Carters received calls they did not answer. The New York precinct received messages urging them to reopen the case, not to find a killer, but to figure out why a staged disappearance fooled everyone. Television producers called John. He refused to go on air. He understood the heat of a story could burn a person to ash. He also understood that momentum drives change. He sent his notes to a detective he respected. The detective promised to move carefully. In Vermont, the town did what towns do when a secret breaks. It lowered its voice and raised its curiosity. Neighbors glanced at the duplex and then looked away. The grocery clerk mentioned a reporter had been around, and the whisper moved through the aisles like a draft. Claire did not show up for her morning walk the day the article posted. She stopped answering her door. She did what she had always done when the past got too loud. She waited. She hoped it would blow over. John kept reporting. He returned to the inn and asked the owner not to share information with strangers. He called a victim advocate and asked what steps could be taken to help a person who had constructed a private life under an assumed name. He left another card at the Carter's store with a note. "I will protect what I can. Please call me." He also documented the thread that changed the shape of the story forever. On a forum where true crime enthusiasts traded theories, someone posted a link to John's article alongside a map pin that narrowed Claire's town to 3 possibilities. The post stayed up for an hour before moderators removed it. An hour was enough. People with fewer scruples had saved. John did not know that in those same days, Mark Jensen, already battered by years of drinking and charges that had cost him a chunk of his life, read the article on a borrowed phone. He knew only that the audience had shifted from curious strangers to one dangerous man. He also did not know that his own observation about the parents' quiet visits would confirm to that man what he could not bear to admit. The woman who left him had built a life without him, and had help. The article's final section was restrained. It laid out the chain of evidence in simple steps: a city case ignored, a car as decoy, a quiet Vermont life under a new name, a family that chose silence over spectacle. It argued for a careful path forward, a reopened investigation focused not on punishment for fraud, but on safety for a woman who had once fled for her life. That paragraph aged poorly, but in the moment it felt right. Then came the calls and the cameras and the noise that Emily had tried to outrun. John stood in his apartment at night with the lights off and listened to his phone buzz. He did not answer. He watched the page view counter climb and hated how numbers could look like accomplishment. He thought about what to do next and landed on the only honest conclusion. Keep the focus on process, not sensation. He pitched a follow-up about best practices for handling late-stage identifications, about how to coordinate with police, advocate groups, and families when a cold case unexpectedly warms. The editor agreed. The article went into a queue. Before it could run, John made one more trip north. He did not try to talk to Claire. He sat 2 blocks away with a clear view of the street and wrote down license plates of cars that lingered. He saw one he did not like. A dented sedan with out-of-state tags circling the block twice and then 3 times. He noted the pattern and called the local police. A patrol car drifted by and kept going. By then, the wave had already formed. The revelation that Emily Carter had not died in 1994 changed how people looked at the old file, at the Carters' silence, at Mark Jensen's shadow over the timeline. It also changed something else: the target on a woman who had tried to live quietly. John wrote one last line at the bottom of his notebook page for the case. I wanted the truth to protect her. He paused his reporting and waited to see if the system would move. It did, but too slowly to matter. The story had traveled beyond the reach of careful hands. It had entered the messy air of public curiosity and private obsession. What remained were facts that no one could ignore. The woman in Vermont matched Emily's face and signature. The parents' secret trips pointed to a plan built for safety, not spectacle. The car by the park was a prop, not a crime scene. The old investigation had spent its energy in the wrong places and then stopped. The new reporting had pushed the case back into view. Every piece mattered. Every piece carried risk. The fallout was immediate and unfinished. The phone at the Carters' store rang again and again. The duplex in Vermont felt smaller with each knock at the door. The comments sections filled with people who wanted to help and people who wanted to pry. And in the dark edges where obsession grows, one man drew a line from a headline to a map and decided the story could not end without him. Emily Carter did not die in 1994. That was the breakthrough. But it was only half the truth. The other half waited behind a door in Vermont, in a town that had unknowingly sheltered a secret for years, at the edge of a road where an old threat had found a new path. The revelation had pulled back the curtain. Now the hard question stood in the open. If the family knew, why the long silence? Why had the first investigation tolerated guesswork over rigor? And, most urgent, who was watching the woman who had... She did not look like herself in the days before she vanished. Coworkers remember the change because it broke her routine. Emily was always neat, calm, and on time. That week she arrived pale and tired. She watched the clock. She kept her phone close but never answered in front of anyone. Calls came. She silenced them. A receptionist says 2 different men came to the front desk on 2 different days, asked to see Emily, and left when told she was busy. Emily waved the messages away. "I'll call back," she said once, and didn't. People noticed, but they didn't press. Offices are full of private stress. Most of the time you look away. 2 days before June 17th, a friend says Emily and Mark Jensen fought in the street outside his building. The friend was close enough to hear a voice rise from anger into threat. "If you leave me, I'll kill you." Those were the words. The friend pulled Emily inside and locked the door. Emily shook, then forced a smile and said she had it under control. She did not call the police. This was the 1990s in New York, when restraining orders were slower, when patrol cars were stretched thin, when a woman who lived alone thought twice before turning a volatile boyfriend into an enemy with a badge between them. Mark drank. He had friends who liked to settle arguments off the books. Emily knew that. She also knew that if she stayed, the threat would grow. She needed a way out that would hold. Fear pushes people into narrow corridors. When you are hunted at home, escape often looks like disappearance. Emily went to the only people who would choose her over their reputation. She went to her parents. Robert and Linda Carter ran a corner store in New Jersey. They kept ledgers and lived quietly. They were not the kind of people who staged anything, but they loved their daughter, and they knew enough about Mark to take his threat seriously. In their kitchen, at a small table stacked with bills and a jar of pens, on the day she vanished, Emily followed the script. She left the office at 6:30 with her briefcase and the same gray suit she wore every Tuesday. A security guard remembers her crossing the lobby with quick, clipped steps, eyes down, mouth set. She drove across the bridge and parked in a lot near a public park in Queens. She locked nothing. She left the car open so no one would break a window and call attention to a theft that never happened. She took her bag and walked. No one remembers the woman with the briefcase in the dark. Cities forget faces every minute. That night, when Emily did not come home, Robert and Linda made the call they had agreed to make. They reported their daughter missing. They sounded flat. They did not summon reporters. They did not paste flyers. They let the case become a file without a story. People judged them for it. That was part of the plan. What came next belongs to the part of an investigation people rarely see. There are always more cases than hours, and more questions than answers. The car had no signs of a fight. The lot had no camera. No witness stood up to say she saw a man force a woman into a van. The detective wrote, "Adult missing," because that was all the evidence allowed. And in that vacuum, the strategy Emily had chosen began to work. Mark could not follow what did not exist. There were no headlines to read, no interviews to study, no scheduled press conference where grief slips and truth leaks out. There was nothing public to chase. The family looked cold. The cops looked stuck. The story froze. But a plan only protects if you can hold it, and the hardest part was not leaving. It was staying gone. Emily picked her new name with care. Claire Donovan. It sounded ordinary. She reached Vermont because it was close and quiet and not New Jersey. She rented a small place with cash down and a short. The plan would have failed if she had to carry it alone. She didn't. Robert and Linda learned to act for her sake. They made the first rule, no public grief. The second rule, no written trails. The third rule, no changes to their routine at home that would make neighbors talk. They went to work, counted cash, stacked milk, and nodded to the same customers at the same time each day. Once a year, never on the anniversary, never on a holiday, they left before dawn and drove north. They took back roads. They parked far from the rental. They walked separately. They met their daughter in quiet places, a diner that didn't ask questions, a trailhead that emptied by noon, a church vestibule after weekday mass. The visits were short. They never stayed overnight. They never called her phone. They traded prepaid numbers and then burned them. They hugged in doorways and let go before anyone looked twice. Then they drove home and put their faces back on. People called them heartless. They heard it and kept their mouths shut. For years it held. Mark could not find what the city did not advertise. He drifted, lost work, fought strangers, and fell into liquor. The police had no body, no blood, no witness. The case went into a drawer. And yet, all this time, the truth lived in the open air, in a small town where no one thought to connect a woman named Claire to a New York case from the mid-90s. Emily went to the market on Tuesdays. She kept a tidy porch. She returned library books on time and paid in cash for the late ones. People called her private and left it at that. Then, in 2010, a reporter opened the drawer. John Miller was 35 and tired of writing about ribbon cuttings. He liked the old files because the noise had fallen away. He read the Carter case and circled the same odd lines as the original detective. A missing adult, a car with no struggle, a family that did not plead on. Rumors are a map, if you read them with care. John heard a story from a photographer who had once freelanced in Vermont. A woman who turned her face away from a camera outside a church bake sale. A clerk who asked too many questions about a post office box. A name that surfaced in two unrelated conversations. Claire Donovan. John put gas in his car and drove north. In small towns, strangers stand out. John learned to buy coffee and talk about weather first. He asked about church rosters and volunteer lists. He found a rental office with a manager who had been there long enough to remember leases from 15 years back. When he asked for Claire, the manager pointed to a locked cabinet and said those files had gaps. First payment in cash, birth certificate filed late, no emergency contact listed. He copied what he could with his eyes. He noticed a year of birth that matched Emily's, a height within a quarter inch, and a handwriting loop on the letter C that mirrored the one on Emily's employee application from 1993. He did not have the file, but he had a pattern. He found one photograph tucked in a community board binder from a harvest fair. The image was soft and off-angle, but faces hold themselves the same way over time. When he put that image beside a cutout of Emily from a 1994 firm brochure, the jawline lined up. The eyes did too. The smile was thinner, but time does that. John did not print the photos together yet. He wanted one more anchor. He knocked on doors along a quiet street where Claire had once rented a second-floor apartment. People remembered simple things. A woman who kept to herself. A habit of stepping back when someone raised a phone. A visitor every summer who looked like an older version of her. A neighbor remembered a couple from New Jersey with a station wagon. They came early, left early, and hugged a woman on the porch as if they were saying hello and goodbye in the same. The reaction was immediate. In New Jersey, people who had mocked the Carters as cold now divided into two camps. One side said the parents had done what the system would not do, protect their daughter from a violent man. The other side said they had used the public as a shield and wasted police time while letting suspicion ruin other lives. In New York, former coworkers of Mark Jensen said the threat sounded like him. Former drinking buddies said they were not surprised. The old detective shook his head and told a retired colleague that the case had always smelled like something planned. He just couldn't prove it then. Police looked again at the file. They had no charge to bring for a staged absence 16 years old. There was no fraud case open, no perjury on record. The statute clock had ticked by on anything minor. They could not punish a woman for saving her life by stepping off the grid. They could not punish parents for not performing public grief. They could not punish a reporter for finding the truth. The system has rules. This story had lived between them. What the article did more than anything was end the silence that had kept everyone safe. The secret was no longer a private contract between Emily and her parents. It was public record. That meant Mark could see it too. John did not think about Mark while he wrote. He thought about accuracy and harm, and the ethics of naming someone who wanted to be left alone. He kept the street address out of the piece. He used the town name because everyone else already had. He told himself that the risk was low and the value was high. A cold case now had a resolution. A woman once thought dead was alive. A community could replace rumor with fact. But truth, once loose, travels fast and finds people you wish it wouldn't. The comments turned cruel. The calls began at the Carter store. Some praised, some accused. Reporters gathered outside their door, hungry for the tearful reunion the Carters would not give. In Vermont, curious strangers drove past Claire's street to catch a glimpse of them. Police revisited old interviews, but they had no authority to park a car outside a woman's rented house without a current report of danger. The law lives in the present. The file labeled Emily Carter was now more story than statute. The Vermont Sheriff's Office noted the article and drove by the town once or twice. Nothing looked wrong. You cannot arrest a shadow. The Carters tried, once more, to do what had worked before. Reduce heat, reduce attention, reduce risk. They did not give statements. They did not condemn the reporter or defend themselves. They told Emily to keep her head down and stick to the routine. She did. She went to work. She kept her porch light low. She bought groceries at a different store. She waited. This is the point where the story bends toward the part you already feel coming. You can sense it because stories like this so often end the same way when the past is still alive and angry. The question now is not whether Emily escaped in 1994. She did. The question is whether escape holds once the secret is gone. It was no longer Emily against a boyfriend behind closed doors. It was Emily against a man who had read his name in print and felt the last piece of control slip. A man who had nothing left to lose is the most dangerous shape in any case file. She had outrun him once. She had built a life in the quiet. She had trusted time to dull his obsession, but time does not teach some men anything. And now the breadcrumb trail that had protected her, silence, distance, anonymity, had been brushed into the open by a story meant to end rumors. Instead, it fed one man exactly what he needed. This is where we leave Part 7. Emily Carter did not die in 1994. She chose to live and to vanish. Her parents chose to hold the line with her and pay the price in public scorn. A reporter chose to break the silence because the truth matters. Mark Jensen's fall began the week Emily disappeared. He lost his job within days, first on administrative leave, then with a phone call that ended his salary and benefits. Colleagues stopped answering. The manager who once praised him refused to meet. The bar he used to drink at after work cut him off when reporters started asking questions. His name slid through the city like a warning. He was the boyfriend of the missing woman. People looked away when he walked into a room. Without steady work, he bounced between short-term gigs and overnight shifts. He drank more. He gambled to claw back control and lost whatever he won. He fought in parking lots and hallways and sat in a cell more than once for disorderly conduct. The charge that stuck came 3 years later, a beating outside a club that left another man with a broken jaw. A judge read out a sentence. 3 years. He kept quiet. No one visited. When he got out, he had a record, a temper, and no path forward. Applications went nowhere. Supervisors dismissed him at the first hint of trouble. Landlords took cash and then warned him not to be a problem. He slept in furnished rooms that smelled of other lives. By 2010, he was a man built from grudges. He told himself Emily had ruined him. He told himself her family had framed him in the court of public opinion. He told himself he had been the only one who loved her. It was a story that kept him moving even when there was nowhere to go. Then he read the headline. The article appeared on a weekday morning, posted online before lunch. The photograph was old, Emily at 24, standing in front of a limestone facade in Manhattan, smiling for someone behind the camera. The name in the headline was hers. The subhead was not. A new identity, a small Vermont town, a life in hiding. The byline belonged to a freelance reporter named John Miller. The piece said the missing woman had never been dead. It said the quiet family who refused the cameras had helped. He printed the article at a library, paid cash for a prepaid phone, and rented a compact sedan under a discount plan that didn't ask many questions. The town in the story had a welcome sign and a diner that served eggs all day. He drove there at dusk and parked behind a line of pines that hid the lot from the road. He slept in the driver's seat with a jacket over his chest and woke at dawn to watch the street come alive. The article did not list an address, but it listed details that narrowed the search. A grocery a few blocks from a post office. A house with a small porch. A woman who walked to work some nights and took the back path home. He asked questions with a careful smile. He told a clerk he was looking for an old friend from New Jersey, thought she might be in town, wasn't sure. He kept his name to himself. He took note of faces and routines and the way people looked when they answered a stranger. He found her in the time it takes for a routine to repeat. She crossed the market lot in a gray sweater and carried a cloth bag heavy with fruit. Her hair was shorter, streaked with copper, but the angle of her face didn't lie. She kept her eyes down and moved with purpose. He stayed in the car and watched her walk the sidewalk, turn at the corner, and disappear behind a hedge. He didn't follow that day. He sat still, let the air settle around him, and memorized each step she took. He bought a folding knife and gloves at a hardware store on the edge of town, paying in cash, keeping his voice low. The security camera at the register swept the aisle in a lazy arc, losing detail whenever the lights flickered. He bought coffee at gas stations and threw away the cups miles later. He kept the phone off except when he needed to check a map, then pulled the battery as if the signal could betray him. When it rained, he moved the car under trees. When it didn't, he watched the house. He learned her schedule the way one learns the turns on a familiar road. She left for work just before sunset every other day, cut through the park, and returned after 9. On days off, she gardened, shopped early, or ran the loop along the brook that traced the back of the neighborhood. She avoided cameras without seeming to. She turned her face away from photos without making a show of it. He saw the life John Miller wrote about, quiet, patterned, careful. He told himself it meant she was still afraid of him. The thought did not soften him. It hardened him into a plan. The night he chose came cold and clear after a run of rain. The brook was full from the week's storms. The ground held water. He waited in the car until she left the store and started home with a bag tucked to her ribcage. He followed at a distance with his lights off, turned them on when another car came, and then killed them again when the street emptied. He rolled past her house once after she went in, circled the block, and parked where shadows pooled near a stand of spruce. 9 o'clock slid toward 9:15. He left the car and walked the sidewalk. The porch light had a motion sensor that failed to spark. He stepped into the alcove and put a hand against the door. It moved. He stopped breathing and listened. A faint humming from a refrigerator. The patter of water settling through a gutter. A clock in a back room marked the seconds. He slipped inside and closed the door with a calm hand. She stood in the kitchen, back turned, arranging fruit into a bowl, a sleeve pushed to her elbow. He said her name once, almost conversationally. She flinched and looked over her shoulder, and the color ran from her face in a single instant. She reached for the phone on the counter. He crossed the space in a stride. The bowl shattered on the floor. She fought, hard and direct, surprising him with the force of her writ. Neighbors heard the crash and the cut-off shout, then saw the door ajar and the hallway light spill onto the porch. A woman from across the street called 911. The first officers arrived within minutes. The kitchen told the story in blunt detail. The trail of wet footprints from the yard, the smear of mud on the mat, the fine spray on the lower cabinet door, the half-open refrigerator casting a weak glow. A partial glove print smudged against the counter, a dark thread caught under a fingernail. The clock frozen in time with its hands bent. Identification at the house used the name on the lease, Claire Donovan. That lasted about an hour. When the officer in charge called the detective assigned to coordinate with John Miller after the article, the names connected. By midnight, it was Emily again. The search for the killer began with the small circle that knew her new life and quickly widened to the pattern of a stalker. Camera footage at an intersection 8 blocks away caught a compact sedan looping the neighborhood at 8:41, 8:55, and 9:03. The plate was a rental. The company listed it as checked out to a man who presented an ID that later tested as counterfeit. At the hardware store, a manager remembered selling a knife and gloves to a tall man with a rough voice a week earlier. The store's camera captured the purchase as a blur that matched the driver's silhouette from the street footage. The prepaid phone pinged towers along the path of her evening routines for days before the killing. The pattern repeated the loops of the sedan. The data showed the device moving north from New York, circling the town in the evenings, then going dark near midnight. When investigators executed a warrant and recovered the phone from a rest stop trash bin, the SIM was missing, but residue on the battery matched a brand sold in a strip mall 3 exits south. The clerk remembered the buyer by his hands, scarred knuckles, an old cut across the right. The car rental staff flagged the return attempt before he could complete it. The attendant recognized the driver from a bulletin distributed that morning and called the police while processing the paperwork. Officers intercepted Mark at a gas station on the highway out of town. He raised his hands without a struggle. On the back seat, they found a jacket with torn threads at the cuff. In the trunk, wrapped in a grocery bag, lay a pair of gloves still damp at the wrists. Forensics later matched a fiber from that cuff to the thread under Emily's fingernail. Minute soil particles on the jacket hem were consistent with the creek bed behind her house. Trace analysis on the gloves returned a faint print pattern identical to the partial on her countertop. In the interview room, he said he had driven up to talk. He said he wanted closure. He said he had only gone inside because the door was unlocked and he was worried about her. Confronted with the rentals, the phone records, and the hardware purchase, he retreated to a single line. He had not planned to hurt her. But premeditation does not need a manifesto. It needs steps. A rented car under a false identity. A burner phone following the same route for days. A knife purchased for the job, paid in cash. Gloves to keep prints off the metal and leave next to nothing behind. A week of surveillance, a window chosen for privacy. A body left on a floor no one would see for minutes that mattered. The prosecutor did not have to push hard to call it murder in the first degree. While police built the case, John Miller learned what had happened from a curt call at dawn. He drove to Vermont and sat in his car outside the house while evidence techs moved in and out with sealed bags. He looked at the porch light that had not come on, and the boxwood hedge that had not blocked a man determined to cross it. And he understood the chain that led here. A story. A headline. A town. An address discovered not through a leak but through accumulation. He had no warrant, only curiosity and a notebook. He had verified her identity without telling the police because he believed the story belonged to the public. Now the public had poured in, and a man who should never have known which road to take had followed their footprints. Colleagues reached out, some with sympathy, some with blame. The victim advocacy group he had quoted in his piece called to say they wished he had paused long enough to arrange protection. A veteran editor told him, "This is why some stories wait." He didn't argue. He filed no follow-up. He sent a short statement to a local paper and then sent another email to kill his next assignment. He put away his press badge and left town. The lesson didn't feel noble. It felt heavy and plain. Information moves. It does not ask permission. Sometimes the person who pays is the one you are trying to save. Robert and Linda Carter arrived to answer questions they had spent 16 years avoiding. They told detectives about the plan in 1994, the drives north, the quiet birthdays on back porches, the winter coats passed from a trunk to their daughter's hands with the dome light off. They told the truth. No one had forced them to stay silent. They believed silence was safety. By the time they considered changing course, the story had grown barnacles of rumor. They worried that any press would pull curious people to the town. They worried that any request for official help would create a file, and any file might be read by someone who knew Mark. Investigators considered whether to charge them with obstruction. There was no law against a consenting adult choosing to step out of her old life without telling the world. There was no evidence the family had destroyed or manipulated police records. They had not planted the car. They had not misled detectives beyond declining interviews. In the end, there was grief, not a crime. Mark sat in a county cell while the lab finalized reports. The case against him grew steadier each day. The car, the phone, the hardware clerk, the fibers, the scratches, the route patterns, the witness who saw a man sitting in a sedan under the spruces on the nights before the killing. A judge reviewed the file and refused bail. The indictment followed. The district attorney prepared a timeline that began with a headline and ended with a kitchen clock sealed in an evidence bag. This is where the record stands. The offender in custody. The evidence lined in rows. The narrative clear in a way it had not been in 1994. And still the result is not victory. The person at the center of the story is gone. 16 years of care collapsed in one night because a man refused to let go, and a piece of information bridged the distance he could not cross on his own. The question that hangs over the file is not whether the state can prove its case. It can. The question is what this case demands of all who touched it. What protection systems should look like when a victim has fled and built a life. What a newsroom owes to someone who has already survived one crisis and is living inside a second. What families must weigh when secrecy becomes survival, and survival collides with the public's right to know. The courtroom will answer only part of that. A verdict can mark guilt. It cannot rewind a headline, or replant a garden, or unfreeze the hands of a clock. The bridge to what comes next is narrow and necessary. In the next chapter, the case widens beyond one kitchen in one town. The focus shifts to duty, how police, courts, families, and journalists share or fail that duty. Emily Carter's name will be spoken in hearings and memorials. Evidence will move from lab benches to the witness stand, and we will face the last, hardest balance. The certainty of a conviction against the weight of a life that cannot be restored. In the winter of 2011, inside a Vermont courthouse, the final chapter of Emily Carter's story unfolded. For the first time in 17 years, the man whose shadow had haunted her life stood trial. Mark Jensen, now 44 years old, faced the charge of first-degree murder. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out a sequence that was impossible to ignore. His purchase of a folding knife and gloves in cash, the car he rented under a false name, the disposable cell phone used to track Emily's daily routine, and the traffic cameras that caught his vehicle circling her neighborhood. Piece by piece, the jury saw how his obsession had transformed into premeditation. The evidence told a clear story. Mark hadn't stumbled across Emily by accident. He had planned it, followed her, and when the opportunity came, he acted with full intent to kill. Witnesses confirmed what the evidence already showed. Forensic experts matched fibers found on Emily's hands to the jacket Mark wore when he was arrested. The defense tried to argue that Mark only wanted to talk, that the confrontation spiraled out of control. But the timeline of preparation, the knife, the surveillance, the lies, destroyed that claim. Within 2 weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Mark Jensen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chance, no release, no return to society. But what shocked the courtroom most was not the verdict. It was what Mark said after it. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he rose slowly. He said, "No. I don't regret it. That bitch destroyed my life. I lost everything, so she had to lose everything too." The words froze the room. In that moment, Mark Jensen showed exactly who he had always been: unchanged, unrepentant, and as for Robert and Linda Carter, Emily's parents, the verdict was hollow. They had lived with their secret for 16 years, protecting their daughter in silence, carrying the weight of suspicion from neighbors and investigators. Now they watched the man who terrorized her finally condemned by the law. But there was no sense of victory. They left the courthouse quietly, hand in hand. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but neither Robert nor Linda spoke. To the public, they were the parents who had once seemed cold and distant. Now they were the parents who had sacrificed their reputation to keep their daughter alive, only to lose her anyway. John Miller, the journalist who uncovered Emily's hidden life, sat in the back of the courtroom during the trial. He had followed every testimony, every exhibit, every detail of the prosecution's case. But when Mark uttered his final words, John couldn't stay. He stood up and left before the session was over. For John, it was unbearable. He had spent months digging, cross-checking, and verifying until he uncovered the truth. He believed he was giving Emily back her voice after 16 years of silence. Instead, his article exposed her location, and within weeks, she was gone. John never published another story after that. He disappeared from journalism, refusing interviews, declining projects. When asked why, his answer was always the same: "I didn't see the whole picture." And because of that, a woman died. The story of Emily Carter left wounds on everyone it touched. For her family, it was the pain of sacrifice ending in tragedy. For her community, it was the realization that danger can live next door, hidden in plain sight. For the justice system, it was a reminder of the gaps that existed in the 1990s. No protective orders with real enforcement, no widespread surveillance, no resources for women trapped in violent relationships. Most of all, it became a cautionary tale for journalists. For many, the words felt bitter. Peace had come only after violence, only after the worst outcome. But for those closest to her, it was at least an acknowledgement that her story was no longer hidden. The legacy of Emily Carter is not one of escape, but of warning. She tried to break free, and for 16 years she succeeded. But when her past found her, there was no second chance. Her case remains a stark reminder. Running from violence may buy time, but it does not erase the threat. Silence and secrecy may protect in the short term, but they cannot defeat obsession. The courtroom victory in 2011 put Mark Jensen behind bars, but it came too late to save the life that mattered most. Justice was delivered, but justice delayed is justice denied. A tragedy, because Emily Carter died at the hands of the man she feared most. A lesson, because it shows the price of inaction, the danger of ignoring warning signs, and the cost of secrets kept too long. Emily Carter is remembered not only as a victim, but as a symbol of how fragile safety can be, a symbol of how communities can misjudge silence, and a symbol of the danger of leaving abusers unchecked. You can run, you can hide, but if the person who threatens you still walks free, the danger never disappears. That is the legacy of Emily Carter. If this story struck you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next case we uncover. Leave a comment and share your thoughts. We read them all. A simple like also helps spread these stories to others who may need to hear them. And most importantly, if you or someone you know is trapped in a violent or controlling relationship, don't wait. Reach out to professionals. Seek help immediately. Don't let the silence that cost Emily her life become your story too.